Los Angeles, California. November 1995. The recording studio sat in an unmarked building on Sunset Boulevard, one of those converted warehouses that serious musicians used when they wanted privacy away from industry eyes and gossip columns. Inside Studio C, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, whiskey fumes, and the kind of competitive tension that happens when two of the world's greatest guitarists are locked in a room together with something to prove. Dimebag Darrell had flown in from Texas specifically for this session, leaving Pantera's grueling tour schedule for 72 hours that his management didn't know about. Zakk Wylde had driven down from the Hollywood Hills in his custom-painted Cadillac, telling no one where he was going or why. Between them sat a vintage 1959 Gibson Les Paul Sunburst, worth more money than most people made in a year, resting in its case like a prize waiting to be claimed. The bet was simple. Whoever won the guitar duel got to keep the Gibson and $50,000 in cash that sat in a briefcase next to the mixing board. But what started as a friendly competition between two masters of their craft would devolve into something darker, exposing rivalries and resentments that neither guitarist had acknowledged publicly, creating a rift that would last for years, and producing a recording that both men would later try to destroy every copy of. Before we dive into what really happened in that Los Angeles studio, if you want more untold stories about the legendary guitarists who shaped metal and the secret rivalries that drove them, hit that subscribe button. These are the moments that never made it into the official histories. To understand how Dimebag Darrell and Zakk Wylde ended up in a private studio betting $50,000 and a priceless guitar on their ability to outplay each other, you need to understand the relationship between these two titans of metal guitar. On the surface, they were friends and mutual admirers. Zakk had made his name as Ozzy Osbourne's guitarist, bringing a Southern-influenced heavy blues style to metal that complemented Ozzy's vocals perfectly. His tone was massive, built on pinch harmonics and thick distortion that could shake venues to their foundations. Dimebag, meanwhile, had revolutionized metal guitar with Pantera, creating the groove metal sound that dominated the 90s. His playing characterized by lightning-fast solos, innovative harmonic squeals, and a rhythmic approach that made even the heaviest riffs swing. Both guitarists were from the South. Both loved whiskey and partying. Both had reputations as the nicest guys in metal who would spend hours talking gear with fans after shows. But beneath the friendship was a competitive undercurrent that had been building for years. The competition started innocently enough. They'd run into each other at NAMM shows and guitar clinics, always ending up jamming together in hotel rooms or backstage areas, trading licks and techniques like gunslingers showing off their fastest draws. These sessions were fun and collaborative, both guitarists genuinely enjoying the chance to play with someone who operated at their level. But as their respective careers exploded in the early 90s, the dynamic shifted. Magazine polls would pit them against each other, asking readers who was faster, who had better tone, who was the true king of metal guitar. Dimebag usually won these polls, which created a subtle resentment in Zakk, even though he'd never admit it publicly. Then there were the gear endorsement deals, both guitarists competing for the same high-profile partnerships with amplifier and guitar companies, sometimes undercutting each other's negotiations without realizing it. The industry gossip mill made it worse, with producers and session musicians carrying stories back and forth about who said what about whom. By 1995, the friendly rivalry had developed an edge that neither guitarist acknowledged openly, but both felt acutely. And when a wealthy collector and metal superfan named Marcus Webb approached them with a proposal for a private recording session with serious stakes, Both men saw it as a chance to settle the question of who was truly superior. Marcus Webb was an interesting character in the Los Angeles music scene. He'd made his fortune in commercial real estate during the 80s, then spent the 90s using that money to indulge his passion for rock and metal. He collected vintage guitars and rare recordings, and he had connections throughout the industry that gave him access most fans could only dream of. Marcus had been present at one of those hotel room jam sessions between Dimebag and Zakk, and he'd noticed the competitive tension beneath the surface camaraderie. Being a gambling man with a love of spectacle, he'd conceived an idea: get both guitarists into a professional studio, record them going head-to-head in a structured guitar duel, and put up serious money and a valuable guitar as stakes to ensure they took it seriously. The recording would be for his private collection only, never to be released commercially, making it a pure test of skill without the complications of album sales or public opinion. Marcus approached both guitarists separately, framing the proposal carefully. To Dimebag, he emphasized the chance to prove once and for all that groove metal required as much technical skill as the neoclassical shred that some critics claimed was superior. To Zakk, he stressed the opportunity to demonstrate that bluesy feel and massive tone mattered more than pure speed. To both, he offered $50,000 and the Gibson Les Paul, a guitar that had belonged to a legendary session musician from the 60s and had played on dozens of classic rock recordings. The money was significant, but not life-changing for either guitarist at that point in their careers. The Gibson, however, was special, one of those instruments that players dream about owning, with tone and playability that modern replicas could never quite match. More than the physical stakes, though, what motivated both Dimebag and Zakk was the chance to definitively answer the question of who was better in a context where there could be no debate, no subjective opinions, just two guitars and the truth. The rules Marcus established were simple but comprehensive. The duel would consist of 5 rounds, each testing different aspects of guitar playing: speed and technical precision, tone and feel, improvisation over a backing track, blues-based playing, and a final freestyle round where anything goes. A panel of 3 judges would score each round, awarding points based on technical execution, musicality, and impact. The judges Marcus recruited were heavy hitters: a legendary producer who'd worked with everyone from Black Sabbath to Metallica, a session guitarist whose playing appeared on hundreds of hit records, and a music journalist who'd been covering metal since the early 80s and had interviewed virtually every major guitarist in the genre. The entire session would be recorded on professional equipment, multiple camera angles capturing every moment. Marcus had rented Studio C for 3 full days, ensuring they'd have time to complete the duel without rushing. What neither Dimebag nor Zakk knew as they walked into that studio on the first night was that Marcus had also invited a small audience of about 20 people, industry insiders and serious musicians who'd been sworn to secrecy, creating an atmosphere more like a prize fight than a friendly jam session. When Dimebag arrived and saw the audience, the professional recording setup, and the seriousness with which Marcus had staged everything, he realized this wasn't going to be the casual competition he'd imagined. Zakk arrived 30 minutes later, and the look on his face when he saw the same setup suggested he'd had similar expectations that were now being adjusted. The 2 guitarists greeted each other cordially, but the usual warmth was absent, replaced by a tension that everyone in the room could feel. They went through the technical setup, getting their tones dialed in, Dimebag using his signature Randall amplifiers and Dean ML guitars, Zakk with his Marshall stacks and custom Bullseye Les Pauls. The difference in their tones was immediately apparent even before they started playing, Dimebag's sound sharp and aggressive with a mid-range bite that cut through everything. Zakk's massively thick and saturated with harmonics that seemed to physically move the air in the room. The first round was speed and technical precision, both guitarists given the same complex piece to play, a neoclassical composition that Marcus's producer friend had written specifically for this duel. It featured sweep picking, rapid alternate picking, string skipping, and position shifts that would challenge even the most accomplished players. Dimebag went first, and his performance was surgical, every note clean and precise even at impossible tempos, his fingers moving across the fretboard with the kind of effortless efficiency that comes from decades of obsessive practice. The audience watched in stunned silence, understanding they were witnessing something special. When he finished, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. Then Zakk stepped up, and he took a different approach, playing the same piece but adding his own flourishes, pinch harmonics that squealed and sustained, vibrato that gave emotional depth to what was essentially an exercise in technique. His execution was slightly less precise than Dimebag's, a few notes not quite as clean at the peak speeds, but the musicality and feel were undeniable. The judges conferred and awarded the round to Dimebag based on technical accuracy. But the margin was slim, and the commentary suggested they'd been impressed by Zakk's musicality. Zakk's face showed his disappointment at losing the first round, and something shifted in his demeanor, the friendly competitor attitude hardening into something more serious. The second round was tone and feel, each guitarist given a simple chord progression to play, the challenge being to extract maximum emotion and impact from minimal notes. This was Zakk's territory, and he knew it. His playing on this round was devastating, massive sustained chords that rang out with harmonic overtones, subtle dynamics that built and released tension, vibrato that made the guitar sing like a human voice. The audience was transfixed, several people visibly moved by the sheer emotional weight of what they were hearing. Dimebag followed, and while his playing was excellent, showcasing his own unique voice and tone, it was clear that Zakk had won this round decisively. The judges confirmed it, and suddenly the competition was tied. The third round, improvisation over a backing track, was where things started to get heated, and the friendly competition began transforming into something more like a genuine battle. The backing track Marcus had prepared was a mid-tempo groove with room for extended soloing, the kind of track where a guitarist's true creativity and vocabulary would be on display. Zakk went first this time, and he approached it like a blues rock master, building his solo methodically, starting with simple melodic statements and gradually increasing intensity and complexity, using space and silence as effectively as notes, creating a narrative arc that had the audience nodding along with the rhythm. His 8-minute solo was a clinic in phrasing and dynamics, showcasing why he'd been Aussie's first-call guitarist for years. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, and Zakk allowed himself a small smile, clearly feeling he'd delivered something special. Then Dimebag plugged in for his turn, and instead of trying to match Zakk's bluesy approach, he went in a completely different direction. His solo was aggressive and modern, incorporating rhythmic stabs and groove-oriented phrases that made people want to headbang rather than sway, using his signature harmonic squeal technique to create sounds that seemed impossible from a guitar, building to climaxes of shred that somehow never lost the pocket of the rhythm. His 8 minutes felt shorter because the intensity never let up, a roller coaster of technical wizardry that still managed to be deeply musical. When he finished, the audience response was equally enthusiastic, but different in character. More excited and energized, than the appreciative groove Zakk had created. The judges deliberated longer on this round, clearly struggling with how to compare two completely different but equally valid approaches. Finally, they awarded it to Dimebag by a razor-thin margin, citing his innovation and the way he'd pushed the boundaries of what the backing track could support. Zakk's face went dark when he heard the decision, and for the first time, he said something that revealed his frustration, muttering to himself loud enough for nearby people to hear about how speed always gets rewarded over soul. Dimebag heard it too, and his expression tightened, the implied criticism clearly stinging. The fourth round was blues-based playing, and the atmosphere in the studio had shifted from excited to tense. This should have been Zakk's round to dominate, blues being the foundation of his entire approach to guitar. And indeed, his playing was magnificent, drawing on decades of studying the masters from Albert King to Stevie Ray Vaughan, his phrasing vocal and expressive, his bends hitting exactly the right emotional notes. The audience was completely absorbed, transported by the raw feeling pouring out of his amplifier. But when Dimebag took his turn, he surprised everyone by revealing a side of his playing that he rarely showcased in Pantera's music. His blues playing was grittier and more aggressive than Zakk's, incorporating more dissonance and unusual note choices, but it was undeniably authentic and deeply felt. He wasn't trying to out-blues Zakk. He was showing his own interpretation of the form, and it was compelling in its originality. The judges were clearly torn, and their decision to award the round to Zakk felt almost apologetic, acknowledging that while Dimebag's performance was excellent, Zakk's mastery of traditional blues guitar was simply at another level. The competition was now tied 2 rounds each, everything riding on the final freestyle round where both guitarists could play whatever they wanted. No restrictions, just pure demonstration of their abilities and musical vision. What happened during that 5th and final round would create a rift between Dimebag Darrell and Zakk Wylde that would take years to heal, and produce a recording so intense that both guitarists would later agree it should never be released to the public. Marcus announced a 30-minute break before the final round, and both guitarists retreated to separate areas of the studio. The tension in the room was palpable, the friendly competition having evolved into something more serious, egos and reputations now fully engaged. During the break, Zakk was overheard on a phone call that sounded like he was arguing with someone, his voice raised, and when he came back, his demeanor was different, more aggressive and less controlled. Dimebag spent the break drinking whiskey and going through warm-up exercises, his focus intense and inward. When the final round began, Zakk went first, and he unleashed everything he had. His playing was virtuosic and emotionally raw, cycling through every technique in his arsenal, from delicate finger-picking to crushing power chords to screaming pinch harmonic runs that seemed to defy physics. He played for nearly 15 minutes, the original plan for shorter performances abandoned in his determination to deliver something undeniable. When he finally hit the last chord and let it ring out into silence, the room sat stunned for a moment before erupting in applause. Several people were openly emotional, overwhelmed by the intensity of what they'd witnessed. Zakk unplugged and walked off, breathing hard, sweat pouring down his face, looking like he'd just finished a marathon. Dimebag had to follow that performance, and the weight of it showed on his face as he stepped up. He adjusted his guitar strap, checked his tone one more time, and then launched into a performance that answered Zakk's intensity with his own brand of controlled fury. His playing was less emotional in the traditional sense, but more innovative, incorporating techniques and approaches that pushed the boundaries of what metal guitar could be. mixing brutal aggression with unexpected moments of beauty, showing range that went beyond the groove metal sound he was known for. He played for nearly 20 minutes, unable or unwilling to stop, the performance becoming almost cathartic, an exorcism of all the competitive tension and resentment that had been building. When he finally finished, the silence lasted longer before the applause came, the audience needing time to process what they'd experienced. The judges retired to deliberate, and the wait felt interminable. Dimebag and Zakk stood on opposite sides of the room, not looking at each other, both physically and emotionally drained. When the judges finally returned, their faces were serious. The head judge, the legendary producer, stood and explained that they'd never heard anything quite like what had just happened, that both performances were extraordinary, and choosing between them felt almost impossible. But the rules required a winner, and after extensive discussion, they'd reached a decision. The final round, and therefore the overall competition, was awarded to Dimebag Darrell by the narrowest of margins. The room's reaction was mixed, some people applauding the decision, others looking uncomfortable, everyone sensing that something significant had just happened. Dimebag's response was muted. A nod of acknowledgement, but none of the celebration you'd expect from someone who'd just won $50,000 and a vintage Gibson. Zakk's face went through a series of expressions, shock, anger, resignation, before settling into a mask of forced graciousness. He walked over to Dimebag and shook his hand. The grip perhaps a bit too firm, the eye contact a bit too intense. He said congratulations, but the word came out flat and unconvincing. What happened after the judge's decision revealed just how much damage the competition had done to the friendship between these two guitar legends. The party that Marcus had planned to celebrate the conclusion of the duel never materialized. Zakk left the studio within 20 minutes of the decision being announced, barely speaking to anyone, his entourage rushing to keep up with his angry stride. Dimebag stayed longer, but his mood was somber rather than celebratory. He accepted the Gibson and the money from Marcus, but when the collector suggested they do this again sometime, Dimebag's response was a firm no, saying that some competitions aren't worth what they cost. In the days and weeks that followed, word of the duel leaked out through the 20 witnesses who'd been present, and the story grew in the telling, as stories always do. Some versions claimed that Zakk had smashed equipment after losing. Others said that Dimebag had been so dominant it wasn't even close. Neither was true, but the rumors created awkwardness in the metal guitar community. People taking sides, debates raging about who was really better. For several years after that night, Dimebag and Zakk maintained a distant professional relationship, but the warmth was gone. They'd see each other at industry events and exchange polite greetings, but the easy camaraderie they'd once shared was replaced by careful formality. Both guitarists would occasionally be asked about the rumored competition in interviews, and both would deflect, neither confirming nor denying the details. The recording sat in Marcus Webb's private collection, occasionally shown to trusted friends, but never released or leaked. In the final years of Dimebag's life, there were signs that the rift was healing. The two guitarists reconnected at a memorial event and had a long private conversation that witnesses described as emotional and cathartic. Zakk later said that he'd apologized for being a sore loser and that Dimebag had apologized for letting competition poison a friendship. They'd agreed that the duel had been a mistake, that some questions don't need definitive answers, and that their mutual respect and admiration mattered more than any competition result. The lesson of that night in Los Angeles echoes through the metal guitar world. Technical supremacy matters less than artistic integrity and personal relationships. The duel proved both men were extraordinary, but it also showed that measuring greatness is ultimately pointless when both players operate at the highest level. Their real legacy isn't who won a private competition, but the music they created and the generations of guitarists they inspired.